And that was a little later too, which I think is a natural thing, you know. Suddenly we've got lives. And
Ringo Starr didn't step into the Beatles like some long-lost brother. He walked in like the so-called replacement people assumed wouldn't last, even though he never stopped smiling under those burning stage lights. Reporters joked he was just the luckiest drummer alive, while industry insiders whispered that he didn't really deserve his spot. Inside the band, at least one member treated him like he was just hired for the day, and an outsider with sharp motives twisted their brotherhood into something cold and messy. After years of staying quiet, Ringo finally dropped the names he could never forgive. And the list is way more shocking than anyone expected. Ringo's frustration didn't start in Abbey Road. It started way earlier, in a hospital bed in wartime Liverpool. Young Richard Starkey spent more time fighting illnesses than playing outside, dealing with peritonitis first and tuberculosis right after. He lost years of school and came out shy, quiet, and carrying this heavy feeling that everyone else understood life better than he did. That insecurity stuck with him even when he somehow ended up drumming for the biggest band on the planet. No matter how huge the crowds got, he always felt like the one with the shortest resume. Drums became his escape, his safe place. In groups like Rory Storm and the Hurricanes, he wasn't flashy, but he was solid and dependable, the type of player other musicians trusted without thinking twice. So when the Beatles decided in 1962 that they needed a stronger drummer than Pete Best, they didn't hesitate. They called Ringo. He stepped into EMI as the upgrade, ready to prove himself. But within days, he got hit with a harsh reality check at the Love Me Do session. Producer George Martin didn't trust the new guy yet and brought in session drummer Andy White instead, which left Ringo crushed. Years later, he admitted that the sting never faded. He said, "I went through hell personally because George Martin had this Andy White session drummer. I made him apologize every day." That was the first crack. He joined as the supposed savior, and the first thing the grown-ups in the room did was quietly replace him on the single. And the press only made things worse. Headlines joked he could barely keep time. Critics said he was the least talented Beatle, acting like he was just lucky to stand behind John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Imagine dropping your first big hit and hearing people say you're only there because your friends vouched for you. Inside the band, the hierarchy was impossible to miss. John and Paul were the songwriting machine. George was the overlooked third genius trying to break through. And Ringo, he sang the fun songs, played the steady beats, cracked the jokes, and that was supposed to be his whole worth. But when Brian Epstein passed away in 1967, the group lost the one person who kept all their egos balanced. That calm, friendly drummer suddenly found himself squeezed between three intense personalities, and one of them made him feel smaller than ever. Paul McCartney, the relentless perfectionist, kept pushing him to the edge. If anyone tested Ringo's patience again and again, it was Paul. After Epstein's death, Paul stepped forward as the unofficial leader, calling meetings, organizing sessions, and dragging everyone back into the studio, even when tensions were rising. Ringo summed it up in his simple, real way. Paul always made the phone call. Paul would want us to work all the time because he's the workaholic. It sounds admirable from the outside, but inside the band, that push felt more like control. Paul wasn't just writing songs, he was telling everyone exactly how to play them. And things finally snapped during the White Album sessions in 1968. Paul was locked in on tiny details, making Ringo redo the same drum pattern again and again, until even the calmest guy in the group hit his limit. McCartney finally sat behind the drum kit himself to show Ringo how it should sound, and that moment changed everything. Ringo had already lived through the sting of getting replaced on Love Me Do, so when Paul slid behind the drum kit during the White Album sessions, it didn't feel like a simple correction. It felt like someone stamping a label on him saying he was optional. That moment broke him. Ringo walked out, vanished for almost 2 weeks, and left the band scrambling without their heartbeat. Even decades later, he still talked about how painful it was to be treated like some piece of gear instead of an equal partner. And he kept asking himself one question that cut deeper than any headline. If Paul didn't trust his drumming, what was he even doing there? Paul's perfectionism kept the Beatles polished beyond belief, but inside the studio it came off like the rest of them were session players on their own tracks. For Ringo, who was already carrying the label of the replacement and the least talented, having Paul take his seat felt like his biggest fear unfolding right in front of him. But here's the wild twist. Those two ended up becoming the last real bridge to the old band. In 2015, Paul stood on the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame stage, personally inducted Ringo as a solo artist. and even cracked a joke about inducing him into the hall. Years later, they shared tours, shared stages, and Paul openly said their bond was something very special. It's wild how time flips things. But you know what comes next? John Lennon and Yoko Ono. The moment Ringo realized the band's leader was slipping away, everything around him felt unsteady. Watching John drift into someone he barely recognized left Ringo shaken, because for years John had been the anchor holding the whole ship together. Ringo admired him deeply, even when arguments flew across the room. He was always right there behind John's shoulder like a steady shadow. Then in 1968, something shifted, first quietly, then completely. Yoko Ono didn't just show up beside John, she showed up inside the heart of the band's creative world. Suddenly she was in the studio, in the decision-making, in the conversations, and in the invisible power structure that had always been strictly for the four members. The Beatles had always been a closed circle with equal voices, but overnight there were 5 people in the room, and somehow only one of them seemed to matter. The vibe got stranger by the day. During experimental sessions, Yoko would jump in with suggestions about rhythm or tone, and Ringo was stunned, not by her confidence, but by how quickly John backed her every time. Instead of standing up for his longtime bandmates, John sided with her without hesitation. One day he even looked at Ringo and said, straight up, "Just keep it even." Hearing that hit Ringo hard, especially when he was already carrying the weight of being labeled the least talented. It was like being told, your voice stops where hers starts. Things got tenser every time someone questioned Yoko's constant presence. George Harrison snapped during one heated moment, and John fired back instantly, slamming a table and accusing everyone of disrespect. At that point, it wasn't even about music anymore. It was about loyalty, and John's loyalty had clearly moved. For someone like Ringo, who cared deeply about keeping peace, the emotional cost was heavy. He felt the band losing their leader to a relationship so intense, it left no space for anyone else. Years later, he openly admitted the Beatles were already drifting apart by then. And in one heartbreaking memory, he described visiting John in New York in 1980. They laughed, felt comfortable, and shared a moment that reminded Ringo they were still brothers at the end of the day. And then just weeks later, John was assassinated, leaving all the unresolved tension to disappear into silence before they ever got the chance to face it. Then came Alan Klein, the outsider who didn't walk in with drama, but brought plenty of it later. At first, his arrival felt like relief. With Brian Epstein gone and Apple Corps losing money fast, the Beatles were drowning in confusion. They were world famous, yet their business was falling apart. Ringo, exhausted from smooth-talking executives who said a lot but fixed nothing, found Klein refreshing because he was blunt, aggressive, and ready to battle for them like someone who actually cared. At first, Ringo believed Alan Klein might finally be the fighter the band needed, but it didn't take long for things to twist into something way darker. Klein didn't walk into Apple looking for harmony. He walked in looking for control, and he knew exactly how to use the band's tension to get it. Ringo didn't spot it right away, but the warning signs were everywhere. Klein played each member differently, like he was tuning instruments for his own performance. With John, he acted like a fearless warrior who understood him better than anyone. With George, he pushed the idea that he deserved more space and more respect. With Ringo, he talked tough about protecting the band's legacy, something Ringo took seriously. But behind closed doors, Klein was collecting power, paperwork, and leverage like he was building his own empire. And things exploded the moment Paul refused to sign Klein as manager. Suddenly, the band wasn't united. It was split right down the middle, 3 against 1, and the one was Paul McCartney. Klein saw that weakness and used it like a weapon, stirring arguments, encouraging secret meetings, and nudging the others into decisions that only made the cracks deeper. Ringo watched the arguments get sharper, colder, and way more personal than ever before, and he knew this wasn't just business. This was destruction. The sad part is, Ringo still tried to keep the peace as long as he could. He didn't want to choose sides, didn't want to fight, didn't want to watch his friends turn into rivals. But every time he stepped into a meeting, Klein's presence hung in the air like a storm waiting to hit. Eventually, even Ringo had to face the truth. The Beatles weren't battling each other anymore. They were battling a man who understood chaos better than music. By the time the legal papers started flying, the band was already gone in everything but name. Ringo saw it clearly. The brotherhood he once walked into was now a battlefield controlled by someone who never wrote a song, never played a note, and never cared about the bond between them. And that betrayal stayed with him, because watching the Beatles fall apart wasn't just painful, it was unforgettable. John was the first one to jump into Alan Klein's arms, and George followed fast, hoping this new voice could fix the mess around them. Ringo, tired of chaos and craving stability, eventually signed too. He later explained exactly what pulled him in. Klein was a hustler, and I felt it was time I had someone hustling for me. Behind that tough charm, though, was a strategist who knew exactly how to twist loyalty into a weapon. And Klein didn't need months to understand the cracks inside the band. He read them instantly. He saw Paul's drive for control, John's restless energy, George's deep frustration, and Ringo's desperate want for peace. Then he used each weakness like it was a lever to pull the group apart. Meetings that used to be loud arguments turned into full-on battlegrounds. Decisions that once felt like four brothers agreeing suddenly became 3 against 1 every single time. Within months, Klein had turned tension into a straight-up rupture. Paul refused to sign his contract, and Klein knew exactly how to spin that. He encouraged John, George, and Ringo to move forward without Paul, making that split even sharper. It didn't take long before Paul did the unthinkable. He sued the other 3, along with the Beatles company and Klein in 1970. The lawsuit destroyed whatever friendship was left, and every old wound between Ringo and the others grew deeper, filled with distrust, frustration, and regret. The brotherhood didn't fall apart from music. It fell apart from signatures, lawyers, and courtrooms. Then came the cruel twist, the kind that hits harder the longer you trusted someone. By 1973, Ringo realized the man he believed in had mismanaged money, twisted contracts, and used the Beatles' name like bargaining power. Klein was fired, and investigations followed like smoke after fire. The 3 who once defended him, including Ringo, admitted they'd been wrong. Then Alan Steckler revealed something that cut straight to the bone. He said George once admitted, "The only way the Beatles can ever get together again is if Alan isn't there. I'm ready. So is Ringo." That line says everything. For Ringo, Klein wasn't just a bad choice. He was the deepest betrayal of all. The man Ringo trusted to protect them became the one who guaranteed the Beatles would never stand on a stage together again. That realization stayed with him like a shadow. Then came the truth people took decades to accept. The truth about Ringo Starr's real talent and his legacy. When all of Klein's dust finally settled, Ringo was left asking the hard question everyone had thrown at him for years. Was he really the least talented Beatle? For so long, he'd heard the jokes. People claimed he got lucky, said he rode on John and Paul's genius, and once the band broke apart, those same words echoed louder because nothing was left to hide behind. But time exposed everything. The critics who laughed at him never saw the same sessions where Paul grabbed his seat or John brushed him off. They didn't see the producers who noticed Ringo was the only one who almost never slid off tempo. George Martin, the same man who once replaced him on Love Me Do, later admitted something huge. Ringo wasn't just reliable, he was the click track, the human anchor holding the whole band steady. And when younger drummers studied his style, they learned they couldn't copy it. The feel was too unique, too natural, too locked in. As the years passed, the whole narrative flipped. Ringo launched a real solo career with real hits, and legends like Harrison, Clapton, Dylan, and Elton John kept calling him back, not for nostalgia, but because his groove lifted their music in ways nobody else could deliver. Even Paul, the same man who once corrected his drumming, ended up inducting him into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as a solo artist. Today, Ringo's legacy isn't about luck or simplicity. It's about precision, feel, and loyalty that never broke. He wasn't the least talented Beatle. He was the heartbeat, the foundation that let the other 3 soar. And the longer time moves, the clearer it becomes. Ringo Starr was never the weak link. He was the secret strength nobody noticed until he proved it for half a century. So after seeing everything laid out, who do you think Ringo held the deepest resentment for in his heart? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Hit that like button if you felt something real, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories.